December 29th, 1944. Versailles. General Dwight Eisenhower reads a telegram from British Field Marshal Montgomery for the third time. It's not a request, it's an ultimatum. Montgomery is demanding complete control of all Allied ground forces. If Eisenhower refuses, Montgomery will go over his head directly to Churchill and the combined chiefs. It's a coup attempt disguised as military correspondence. Eisenhower walks to the window and stares at the winter landscape for 5 full minutes. When he turns back, his face carries an expression his staff has never seen before. The Supreme Commander has reached his limit. He calls for his Chief of Staff and drafts a message that will gem the alliance to its core. Quote, "What happens next will determine not just who commands Allied forces, but whether the alliance itself survives. Subscribe to WW2 Gear right now so you never miss these untold stories from the war. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from today? This is the day Eisenhower told Montgomery, 'It's me or you.' Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. Late afternoon light angles through the windows, frost clinging to glass against the winter chill. General Dwight David Eisenhower sits alone at his desk, reading a telegram from Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery for the third time. The words remain unchanged. The demand stands explicit. The threat couldn't be more unmistakable. Outside his office, staff officers navigate the corridors quietly, their voices subdued by an awareness that something fundamental has shifted. In the operations room, maps continue displaying the Ardennes salient, where American and German forces remain locked in combat 13 days after the Wehrmacht's surprise offensive. Bastogne holds. The Bulge is contracting. But here in Versailles, the real battle is about to commence. Eisenhower places the telegram down. He rises, walks to the window, and fixes his gaze on the winter landscape for what witnesses will later estimate as 5 full minutes. When he turns back, his face carries an expression his staff has never witnessed before. Not anger, not frustration, something harder. The Supreme Commander has reached his limit. This isn't another disagreement about strategy or resources. This is an ultimatum disguised as military correspondence. And Eisenhower understands with absolute clarity that if he doesn't act now, decisively and without compromise, his command authority will cease to exist in any meaningful sense. The question is no longer whether to accommodate Montgomery. The question is whether Eisenhower will remain Supreme Commander at all. The relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery had been fracturing since September 1st, 1944, when Eisenhower assumed direct command of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery had been ground forces commander during the Normandy invasion. He believed, on professional and national grounds, that he should retain that position permanently. The British Field Marshal took the change personally. Throughout autumn 1944, Montgomery advocated relentlessly for a single narrow thrust into northern Germany under his command rather than Eisenhower's broad front strategy. In September, he pushed for Operation Market Garden, an airborne assault to seize bridges across the Rhine. De Guingand, Montgomery's own chief of staff, expressed private reservations. The operation failed with heavy losses at Arnhem. By October, Montgomery was insisting through back channels that he outranked Lieutenant General Omar Bradley and should command all Allied ground forces as a matter of protocol. Eisenhower deflected, reorganized subordinate commands, and compromised on operational details while preserving his own authority. In November, Montgomery sent a letter so insulting in its criticism of Eisenhower's leadership that Major General Francis de Guingand flew personally to Versailles to prevent what he recognized as an irreparable breach. Each confrontation followed the same pattern. Montgomery would demand, criticize, or threaten. Eisenhower would absorb the insult, manage the crisis, and preserve the alliance. But each incident raised the cost. American commanders grew increasingly resentful. Bradley, in particular, seethed at what he viewed as British arrogance subsidized by American restraint. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's own deputy, openly advocated for Montgomery's relief. December 16, 1944, 0530 hours. German forces under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt launched Operation Wacht am Rhein through the Ardennes forest. 3 German armies attacked across an 80-mile front, held by 4 American divisions. The offensive split Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army and Lieutenant General William Simpson's 9th Army, severing communications with Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg. Eisenhower responded on December 20th with a decision he knew would be controversial. He temporarily placed 1st and 9th Armies under Montgomery's operational control. The tactical logic was sound. Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters was closer to the northern shoulder of the German penetration. Bradley's headquarters had lost direct communication with units north of the Bulge. Montgomery could restore coordination faster. Bradley understood the military necessity but hated the political implications. He later wrote that the decision was tactically correct, even though it burned like acid in his throat. What Bradley anticipated was Montgomery's reaction. The British Field Marshal accepted temporary command on December 20th, with what observers described as barely concealed satisfaction. Major General de Guingamp noted in his diary that Montgomery practically glowed when the order came through. Within 24 hours, Montgomery was reorganizing American units, redirecting supply columns, and issuing orders that contradicted existing American dispositions. Brigadier General William Keane, aide to General Hodges, recorded his commander's white-faced reaction. Hodges told him Montgomery was acting like he had just conquered them, not the Germans. But Montgomery wasn't just repositioning forces. He was constructing a narrative that the Battle of the Bulge represented American failure, requiring British intervention to remedy. Montgomery immediately began characterizing the Ardennes offensive in terms that minimized American resistance and maximized British rescue. In communications to London, in conversations with British officers, in meetings with war correspondents, Montgomery portrayed American forces as having been caught unprepared through incompetence. Major General John Whiteley, Deputy Chief of Staff at Supreme Headquarters, watched with growing alarm. He later testified that Montgomery was rewriting history in real time. The reality was substantially different. Yes, German forces achieved tactical surprise. Yes, American units were pushed back from initial positions. But at critical points, American forces fought with desperate effectiveness that blunted the German offensive. At St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division held for 6 days against overwhelming odds, buying time for reserves to deploy. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division refused surrender, despite complete encirclement. These defensive stands were not failures requiring rescue. They were American tactical successes that turned the operational tide of the entire battle before Montgomery ever assumed command. Montgomery either failed to grasp this reality or chose to ignore it. His narrative served British political interests. It positioned him as the indispensable commander whose experience had saved inexperienced Americans from catastrophe. By late December, Montgomery's characterization was spreading through British military and political circles. The narrative was reaching London newspapers. American officers at Supreme Headquarters began receiving reports that British accounts were crediting Montgomery with turning the battle. The anger was palpable. Captain Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide, recorded the mounting fury in American command circles. But Eisenhower, ever the coalition diplomat, chose to handle tensions quietly through careful messages and back-channel communications. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference at his headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium. For over an hour, he lectured assembled war correspondents without notes. He described the Battle of the Bulge as one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. He spoke of how he had taken personal command of the situation, employed the whole available power of the British group of armies, and seen the picture as a whole. Montgomery praised American soldiers as brave fighting men. He called Eisenhower the captain of the team and declared himself absolutely devoted to Ike. But the overall impression was unmistakable. Montgomery had saved the Americans from their own mistakes. The structure of his presentation, the repeated use of I, the framing of British intervention as decisive, all combined to claim credit for turning the battle. News reached Versailles within hours. Butcher recorded that he had never seen Eisenhower that angry. The Supreme Commander's face went from red to purple. Eisenhower said that man just claimed credit for the whole operation while American soldiers were still dying in those woods. But even then, Eisenhower chose restraint. He sent carefully worded messages to Montgomery suggesting such public statements might damage Allied unity. Major General Kenneth Strong, intelligence chief at Supreme Headquarters, observed that Eisenhower was performing a miracle of patience. Any other commander would have relieved Montgomery immediately. But Eisenhower understood that firing a British field marshal might fracture the alliance itself. So once again, Eisenhower absorbed the insult and worked to manage the crisis rather than escalate it. This pattern had repeated throughout the campaign. In September 1944, after the successful liberation of France, Montgomery demanded all Allied resources for a single narrow thrust into Germany under his command. Eisenhower refused, insisting on the broad front strategy. Montgomery appealed to Churchill. Eisenhower stood firm but compromised on resource allocation. In October, Montgomery insisted he outranked Bradley and should command all American ground forces. Eisenhower deflected the demand through reorganization that preserved command relationships while adjusting operational boundaries. In November, Montgomery sent his private letter criticizing Eisenhower's strategic competence in terms so insulting that de Guingamp flew to Versailles specifically to prevent an irreparable break. Each time, Eisenhower absorbed the pressure, managed the crisis, and preserved the alliance. But each accommodation raised the cost to inter-Allied relations. Brigadier General Arthur Nevins, who worked in operations at Supreme Headquarters, later wrote that everyone watched Eisenhower carry this burden. Montgomery would make impossible demands, criticize American leadership, claim unearned credit, and Eisenhower would simply take it. The question was how long he could continue. American tolerance was not infinite. By December 1944, senior American commanders were openly questioning why Eisenhower continued to protect Montgomery. Bradley's resentment was visceral. Lieutenant General George Patton referred to Montgomery in private correspondence as, quote, "2." Even within Supreme Headquarters staff, patience with Montgomery's behavior was exhausted. But Eisenhower held the line because he believed coalition unity required it. Montgomery's telegram arrived at Supreme Headquarters on December 29, 1944. This communication was different. It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was an ultimatum. Montgomery wrote that the current command structure was quite unworkable. He insisted there must be one commander for all ground forces with authority to coordinate all Allied operations from Switzerland to the North Sea. Montgomery demanded that Eisenhower grant him this authority immediately. If Eisenhower refused, Montgomery stated he would have no choice but to take his concerns directly to Prime Minister Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff, where he was confident British military opinion would support his position. The threat was explicit and calculated. Montgomery was attempting to go over Eisenhower's head and force a change in command structure through political pressure. Colonel James Galt, British liaison officer at Supreme Headquarters, recognized immediately what had occurred. Montgomery had finally overplayed his hand. He thought he held all the cards. He didn't realize he had just declared war on Eisenhower's command authority. The telegram was, in essence, a military coup attempt disguised as professional disagreement. Eisenhower read the telegram 3 times. Then he stood, walked to the window, and stared at the winter landscape for nearly 5 minutes. When he turned back to his desk, his expression had changed. He called for his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Beadle Smith. What happened next would determine whether Eisenhower remained supreme commander or became a figurehead, mediating between competing national interests. Smith arrived within minutes and found Eisenhower already drafting a response. This was not another diplomatic deflection. This was something entirely different. Eisenhower's draft message was brutal in its clarity. He wrote that Montgomery's attitude had become intolerable and his latest demand was completely unacceptable. He stated he had submitted his own position to General George Marshall and the combined chiefs of staff with a condition: they must choose between him and Montgomery. One of them would be leaving the European theater. Eisenhower made clear he didn't care which one. The message concluded that he was tired of making excuses for a man who thought his nationality made him superior to everyone else. Smith read the draft and looked up with something like shock. Eisenhower met his gaze steadily. and said he'd had enough. Smith realized this wasn't emotional reaction or tactical bluster. Eisenhower had reached his absolute limit and meant every word. But Smith was a brilliant staff officer for a reason. He understood that while Eisenhower's anger was justified, the actual message needed careful handling. He convinced Eisenhower to let him draft a parallel communication to Marshall that would present the situation in terms Washington could act upon. The telegram that went to Marshall that evening was professional and precise, but its meaning was unmistakable. Eisenhower outlined Montgomery's demand, explained why it was militarily unsound and politically impossible, and then stated this matter had reached the point where it must be decided at the highest level. Either Montgomery conformed to his command authority, or Eisenhower could not continue to function effectively as Supreme Commander. He requested an immediate decision from the combined Chiefs of Staff. Marshall received Eisenhower's telegram late on December 29th. He read it twice, then called Admiral Ernest King and General Henry Arnold. Within an hour, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had assembled. Marshall laid out the situation in blunt terms. Eisenhower was preparing to resign unless Montgomery backed down. They needed to decide immediately whether to support their commander or let the British dictate command structure. The discussion was brief. Admiral King stated flatly they supported Eisenhower. Period. If the British wanted Montgomery in command, they could run their own war. Arnold concurred. Eisenhower had been carrying Montgomery for months. If Montgomery couldn't serve under an American commander, he needed to go. Marshall immediately drafted a telegram for delivery the next morning. The message to Eisenhower was unequivocal, but Marshall did more than just support Eisenhower. He understood this confrontation needed resolution at the political level, and quickly. He called the White House and requested an immediate meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt. That night, Marshall briefed Roosevelt on the crisis. The president's response was characteristically direct. Eisenhower stays. Montgomery obeys his orders, or he's done. Call Churchill and make it clear. The American position was now absolute. There would be no compromise on command authority. The alliance was between equals, or it was nothing. In London, the telegram from Washington arrived at 10 Downing Street in the early hours of December 30th. Churchill read it and immediately grasped the magnitude of what had occurred. His response to his military secretary was recorded. Good God, Eisenhower has actually done it. He's forced the issue. Churchill knew that if Britain tried to defend Montgomery's position now, it would fracture the alliance. The American contribution to the war effort dwarfed Britain's at this point in December 1944. There were more American divisions in Europe than British and Canadian combined. American logistics sustained the entire operation. American industrial capacity was producing the vast majority of equipment, fuel, and ammunition. If this came down to choosing sides, Britain would lose not just the argument, but potentially post-war influence. Churchill did what he always did in such moments. He acted decisively to preserve the larger relationship. He immediately sent for Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. The meeting in the early morning of December 30th was tense. Brooke, who had consistently supported Montgomery, argued the Field Marshal was tactically correct, even if politically clumsy. Churchill cut him off. He didn't care if Montgomery's tactical assessment was correct. Montgomery was trying to force a change in command structure by threatening his superior officer. That was insubordination. If Britain defended it, they would lose Eisenhower and possibly full American cooperation. Churchill drafted his own message to Montgomery that morning. It was polite but unmistakable. Montgomery must back down immediately. Montgomery received both Churchill's directive and the implicit threat in Eisenhower's referral to higher authority on the morning of December 30th. His chief of staff, de Guingand, had already seen the situation clearly. He told Montgomery he had to retreat immediately, not just because Churchill ordered it, but because he had badly miscalculated. He thought the Americans needed him more than he needed them. He was wrong. What followed was what historians have called the fastest reversal in military correspondence. Montgomery drafted a telegram to Eisenhower that arrived at Supreme Headquarters on December 30th. It was conciliatory in tone, almost apologetic. Montgomery wrote he was distressed, Eisenhower should be worried, and asked him to dismiss the matter from his mind. He declared himself absolutely devoted to Eisenhower's service and his most loyal subordinate. The telegram continued, walking back every implication of his demands. Whatever Eisenhower decided, Montgomery would support wholeheartedly. If present command arrangements should continue unchanged, he would accept without reservation. He concluded with almost desperate reassurance that he was under Eisenhower's command and would remain so. That had never been in question. But the damage was done. On January 1st, 1945, Eisenhower issued new command directives. 1st and 9th Armies would return to Bradley's command as soon as the tactical situation permitted. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would continue on the northern flank with clearly defined boundaries and objectives. Most importantly, Eisenhower made explicit in his directive that he exercised complete command authority over all Allied forces in this theater. His decisions on command matters were final. The immediate consequence was clear to everyone. The era of negotiating with Montgomery was over. Eisenhower had drawn a line with full backing from Washington and London to enforce it. Brigadier General Thor Smith, who worked in operations at Supreme Headquarters, observed the change immediately. Before December 29th, Montgomery could send demands, and Eisenhower would work around them. After, Eisenhower's response to any Montgomery request was essentially, "Comply, or I'll go to Marshall." The command relationship never recovered. Eisenhower and Montgomery continued to work together professionally through the final campaigns. They attended the same meetings, coordinated operations, maintained the appearance of Allied cooperation. But the warmth was gone. Air Chief Marshal Tedder observed that before December 1944, Eisenhower would invite Montgomery to dinner and try to smooth disagreements personally. After, their meetings were formal, brief, and strictly business. Bradley was less restrained in his gratitude. He wrote to Eisenhower on January 10th, formally thanking him for his support during the difficult period. Montgomery's behavior during the Bulge had been an insult to every American soldier who fought and died in those woods. Bradley was grateful Eisenhower finally stood up to him. Bradley later wrote in his memoirs that December 29th was the day Eisenhower stopped trying to make everyone happy and started commanding like the supreme commander he was supposed to be. The episode revealed something fundamental about Eisenhower's leadership. He had been criticized, fairly at times, for being too political, too willing to compromise, too concerned with keeping everyone happy. December 29th, 1944, showed that characterization was incomplete. Eisenhower was willing to compromise up to a point, but when that point was reached, he could act with decisive finality. Montgomery had found the line. The lesson resonates beyond World War II. Leadership in coalition warfare is not about making everyone happy. It's not about endless compromise or perpetual negotiation. It's about creating a structure where national pride can coexist with unified command, where political concerns are acknowledged, but military necessity prevails, and where someone must have final authority respected by all parties. That someone must be willing to risk everything, including the coalition itself, to maintain that authority. Montgomery learned this lesson too late. Eisenhower knew it all along, but hoped he wouldn't have to prove it. On December 29, 1944, he proved it. And in doing so, he not only preserved the alliance but strengthened it for the final drive into Germany. The day Eisenhower finally cut Montgomery off was the day the Western Alliance stopped being an experiment in coalition warfare and became an established fact with clear rules. Command authority had been asserted. It would not be challenged again. If this story of leadership, command, and the moment Eisenhower drew the line has resonated with you, subscribe to WW2 Gear right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the critical decisions that shaped the war. Give this video a like if you appreciate how we bring these command confrontations to life with meticulous research and compelling storytelling. Share it with anyone who loves military history or wants to understand how coalition leadership really works under pressure. Drop a comment and tell us, was Eisenhower right to risk the alliance to assert his authority? Or should he have continued accommodating Montgomery? And where are you watching from? We love hearing from our global community of history enthusiasts. Remember, sometimes the hardest decision a leader makes isn't about defeating the enemy. It's about standing firm with an ally who's forgotten who's in command. Eisenhower understood that. On December 29, 1944, he proved it, and the alliance was stronger for it.